their 2018 meeting, they said that to avoid a climate catastrophe, the world would have to decrease its CO2 input by 45% by 2030 and go to net zero by 2050. However, by 2024, the world increased it by 10%, and yet we're certainly no closer to a climate calamity because of this.
This is Climate Debrief, brought to you by the CO2 Coalition. I'm Angela Wheeler. We'll soon be talking with Dr. Wally Manheimer about his recent publication entitled False Prophets and Climate Change. Dr. Manheimer is a Life Fellow of the American Physical Society and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. He spent 34 years at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, serving as an ST-16 senior scientist for his last 14 years there. Now a consultant, he's authored more than 150 refereed papers on fusion, beams, microwaves, radar, and plasma tech. Since leaving the lab as a full-time employee in 2004, he has worked on his own scientific projects. One such project is fusion breeding, the use of fusion neutrons to breed fuel for thermal nuclear reactors. The CO2 Coalition and many others have demonstrated with solid scientific work that there is no climate crisis, to which Dr. Manheimer agrees. In his latest paper, False Prophets and Climate Change, he describes his belief that there is insight from the Bible of a false climate narrative. Dr. Manheimer, can you give us an example?
One thing the Bible says is that not too long after the creation, God became dissatisfied with the world, and not only that, he decided to take some individual people into his confidence. And these are the prophets in the biblical world. And they were people who spoke to God and instructed them what to do. One example, of course, is Noah, where God said, "The end of all flesh has come before me, and the earth is about to be filled with violence. I am about to destroy them with the earth." And the rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. These are direct biblical quotes. And he took Noah into his confidence. Noah built the ark and brought the animals into it and rode out the storm. And then when the waters receded, he began again. After the Exodus, the Jews were in the Sinai for 40 years. And it was very hard for them. And they began to take it out on Moses. And the Lord said to Moses, one thing, they didn't have any water. The Lord said to Moses, and again, this is a direct biblical quote, "Pass before your people, take your staff, strike the rock, and water will come gushing out of it. Then the people will be able to drink." So Moses struck the rock as he was told, and water gushed out, and the elders looked on. So that is, again, a direct biblical quote. And these people are prophets, and the Bible introduces us to the idea of prophets. But how do you know whether the prophet really spoke to God or not? There's no way of telling. And it warned of false prophets, and probably most famously of Jesus on the Mount, where he said, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravaging wolves." Again, a direct biblical quote. And here is a picture of Jesus giving the Sermon of the Mount and saying that, among other things. Well, how do you tell false prophets from true prophets? Well, in the biblical world, it's harder because you really don't know whether anyone spoke to God or not, and there's no way of knowing. But if the prophecy was real in the biblical world, something happened. There was a flood, like God said to Noah. Water did come out of the rock, like God said to Moses. But in the modern world, the more secular modern world, it's a little easier. Real or false claims to have knowledge that others cannot have. Knowledge from, say, secret government knowledge of scientific knowledge, knowledge of psychology, whatever. And it's possible to check on this knowledge, so it's easier to check in the modern world than in the biblical world. Also, we can check on the prophecy. Did it really come true? For instance, the prophet might have prophesied that there was a big war coming from some country which looked peaceful, which surprisingly did occur, the real prophet, or surprisingly didn't occur, it was probably a false prophet.
Do you see any insight from American history? Are there false prophets involved?
False prophecies have been a factor of American history for at least 300 years. How does the harm that false prophets persist? And I don't think anyone has an answer to this. And I think this is the best answer was given by Dick Lindzen, which I will read, when he was talking about the climate dilemma. What historians will definitely wonder about in future centuries is how deeply flawed logic, obscured by shrewd and unrelenting propaganda, actually enabled a coalition of powerful special interests to convince nearly everyone in the world that CO2 from human industry was a dangerous, planet-destroying toxin. It will be remembered as the greatest mass delusion in the history of the world that CO2, the life of plants, was considered for a time to be a deadly poison. So he just says these mass delusions exist. In fact, they even wrote a book on it. Here's a cover of it. And for some reason, mass delusions initiated by false prophets can occur for a very long time. And there are several examples in American history. Back in 1690, there was the Salem witchcraft trials. And this is really the tail end of the worry about witchcraft, which plagued Europe for centuries. But this was probably the only case in America. And the Reverend Paris lived is the false prophet here that I'm saying. They lived in a house in camp with two girls, his daughter and his niece, and they had a slave they brought back from Barbados to Tuba, and she would scare the girls with stories of witchcraft and magic. And the girls began to all sort of go crazy collectively. They never saw any witches, but they saw the witches' specters, which was regarded seriously at the time. And people challenged the girls at their own risk. One of the people challenged the girls, how ridiculous it was John Proctor. Picture on the lower left is him at his execution. He was actually accused of being a witch and died for it. And one person that I always mention when I talk about these mass delusions is the person who ends them. The good witch was Governor William Phipps, who saw that people were so preoccupied by this witchcraft that they weren't tending their fields, and starvation was a real possibility. And he ended it by outlawing spectral evidence. No longer will someone say, we see the specter of a witch doing this or that. They got to say, we see our physical witch doing this or that. And also allowing accused witches to recant their confessions. Somehow, if they confessed, it would save them from the gallows. So that's an example of a false prophet creating mass delusion and doing real harm. The next one I'll talk about is one that probably some of the older of us remember, is Joseph McCarthy. So Senator McCarthy made an initial speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, saying there were many and varying numbers of communists in the Defense Department. And people took him at his word, and he never gave a real number. And there was a movie from about 1962 which sort of mocked this. It's called The Manchurian Candidate. And the senator in that movie, not too bright, had trouble deciding. He was worried that he always had to mix up the numbers in the Defense Department. But while McCarthy was a bachelor at this time, the real evil genius in the movie was his wife, Senator Iceland's wife, played by Angela Lansbury. And she said, okay, you want to have a number. It really hurts our case, but we'll take a number. And he says, yeah, a number I can easily remember. And he's shaking a bottle of ketchup on his hamburger. And she says, okay, the number will be 57. And he did that. Well, in the real case, the good witch was Joseph Welch. And the McCarthy panic really lasted for 4 years. And people had their lives ruined by it. So the good witch came when McCarthy picked on the army, and Joseph Welch was the lawyer defending the army. And Joseph Welch's words were, and I'll read them, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I have never really gauged your cruelty and recklessness. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me." And that really sort of turned people off on it. And McCarthy was actually censured by the Senate and fell into oblivion, died a few years later of alcoholism. And the last one is almost the strangest. In the 1980s and 90s, many preschool teachers were accused of sexual abuse of 3- and 4-year-old kids by a new breed of former prophets, psychologists and social workers who over and over interviewed these kids. Now there were 6 or 7 hardly responsible adults with their anatomically correct dolls until they said what the false prophets wanted to hear, namely that they were people they saw suffered from sex abuse from their teachers. Clearly, this is analogous to, at least in my mind, this is analogous to spectral evidence in Salem. In fact, I regard this mass delusion as so similar to Salem's mass delusions that it's almost spooky. And yet no governor rose up to challenge this practice of what's clearly spectral evidence. Many were in prison for long periods of time. And here are just 2 pictures of the victims. This is Gerald Amaral, one of the leaders of one of the preschools. He was imprisoned for 18 years, falsely imprisoned for 18 years. Here he is hugging his daughter and wife after he finally got out after 18 years of imprisonment. Another one was Dawn Wilson, a young pregnant single mother who was caught up in the maelstrom. She was like 23 at the time. She was offered a 10-year sentence and refused it, and she was sentenced to life. She served 5 years because the community finally came to its senses. And the good witch here is Dorothy Rabinowitz, a Wall Street Journal reporter who saw the faulty claims of sex abuse and wrote a long series of articles exposing the madness of it. And finally, people began to believe her, and she actually won a Pulitzer Prize for this. So there are examples of mass delusions coming from false prophets in American history.
Do you see analogies between the climate dilemma and false prophets?
Well, the climate mass delusion is just the same as these other mass delusions mentioned here. It's promoted by false prophets. Let's just say these false prophets are participants at the yearly United Nations IPCC meetings. These are meetings held in expensive, attractive cities, and it attracts many high government officials, captains of industry, celebrities, and other grand poobahs. To show how out of touch they are, in their 2018 meeting, they said that to avoid a climate catastrophe, the world would have to decrease its CO2 input by 45% by 2030 and go to net zero carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by 2050. However, by 2024, halfway to 2030, instead of decreasing its carbon dioxide input by, say, 25%, like they insisted, the world increased it by 10%. And yet we're certainly no closer to a climate calamity because of this. Well, the climate prophets failed both tests. Many others have investigated their science and found it faulty. That's test number 1. After 30 years, their prophecies of doom have all proven to be false. So they failed both of the tests as to whether someone is a real prophet or a false prophet. And let's just take a look at some of what's the effect of some of their prophecies. Here are just some quick images of it. On the far left, there's a picture of San Diego Harbor, fairly low-lying ground, in 1966 and now. And why are they the same? I would have thought that San Diego Harbor from 1966 would be buried in water, but it hasn't. I mean, maybe the ocean rose a couple of centimeters, but it certainly didn't rise anything remotely like a meter. And so what does the climate calamity say about that? Look at the windmills. Here's Altamont Pass, California. Look at how totally wrecked the view of this, the land here. Under that, there's a solar farm in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and it was just completely wrecked. And solar panels contain many water-soluble poisonous materials and chemicals which have a real threat of leaching into the soil, even if there's not a hurricane. And what do the windmill people do when the windmills wear out? Well, they're supposed to take them down. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Here are some abandoned wind terminals in Harlingen, Texas. This was taken in 2017. And even if they take down the turbines, which have some salvage value, but the base is 500 tons of steel and concrete, and that's not going anywhere. I mean, 1,000 years from now, our descendants are going to walk around and see all of these bases there, these big chunks of steel and concrete, and saying, what the heck were their primitive ancestors thinking of to put all of these here? Here's another one of ice-covered solar panels in Germany in the winter of 2021. And one thing is that the lithium-ion batteries are real fire dangers. Here's a picture of a fire spreading from bus to bus in an underground parking lot. Germany now forbids electric cars in the underground garages. And I just have some relevant headlines. Massive power outage in Spain and Portugal leaves thousands stranded and millions without light. And it was serious. People were stuck in elevators for hours or underground trains for hours with no idea what's going on. And this is a time when 70% of Spanish power was being generated by windmills. There was no weather impediment. Another one is Mikey Sherrill, just off her successful campaign as governor of New Jersey, my state, said that New Jersey must declare an emergency in utility costs because utility costs in New Jersey are rising like a bat out of you-know-where. Now, what I said, this is an emergency of their own making. So Governor Murphy, her predecessor, closed all the coal-fired plants. I remember when I used to take the train in New York City 10 years ago, I passed by a big coal-fired plant. They closed, and it's not there anymore. They closed one of the two nuclear plants, and they refused to allow gas pipelines in. And that's because Governor Murphy and I guess Governor-elect Mikey Sherrill wants to offshore wind power. And she really can end the emergency as a governor. All she has to do is undo all the harm her predecessor did. Other headlines: raining in California's runaway electric rates, why Britain's electric bills are some of the highest in the world, over 4 million people in Germany struggle to pay their gas and electric bills, California's power grid faces potential challenges.
Dr. Manheimer, do you see any hope that there is a good witch who can get us out of this mess?
Here are some of the people who've been applying for the position for like 10 years. There's, of course, Will Happer, there's Dick Lindzen, Steve Koonin, Judith Curry, Gregory Wrightstone, the head of our organization. They've been bashing their head against the wall for 10 years and more without getting anywhere. So we've been out this for 10 years, and all of a sudden in walks President Trump. Here's his White House government order, presidential executive order. And he says no more federal money going to support windmills and solar powers. And that might be all it takes. Perhaps he can huff and he can puff and he can blow down this gigantic house of cards. And if he does, I think that'll be a very important part of his legacy.
Wally, we thank you so much for offering your perspective on false prophets and climate change. We hope to have you again as a guest on Climate Debrief.
Thank you for watching. The Climate Debrief podcast is funded by listeners like you. If you enjoyed listening to this episode of Climate Debrief, please like, comment, and subscribe. We read all of your feedback. If you are interested in finding out more about the CO2 Coalition and its mission, visit our website at co2coalition.org. Our host and executive producer is Angela Wheeler. Production by Ethan Audie and Scott Wheeler. Technical production and editing by Joseph von Spakovsky.